chose another Republican or semi-Republican priority, free trade. In this case, free trade with Mexico. If you'd asked me in 2000, I would then have been ready to conclude that NAFTA was a major success. But the key argument in favor of NAFTA had always been that it was the most promising road open to raise the chances for Mexican development, to increase the odds that Mexico would become democratic and prosperous. And that even though NAFTA had been associated with yet another peso crisis, I would have said 6 years ago that the effects of NAFTA had been in the direction of helping Mexican development, and thus that the U.S. was actually performed its neighborly duty to try to help Mexico develop economically, and also politically and socially, and also that it had been a good deal for the United States because a Mexico that is better off is a very good thing for the United States. It's much better to have prosperous, democratic, relatively wealthy, and socially calm neighbors than the reverse. And 6 years ago, I'd have pointed to the fact that even though there had been yet another peso crisis, that even though Mexico's late 1990s had been relatively rough, I would have pointed to the fact that exports had boomed, that NAFTA had done its job making Mexico a nice place to produce in order to serve the world's largest consumer market, and that with guaranteed tariff-free access to the world's largest consumer market, that couldn't help but be a positive step in Mexican development. Now I'm not so sure. That is, exports have boomed, exports have continued to boom. Mexican exports have gone from 10% of Mexican GDP in 1990 to 17% of GDP 6 years ago, to it looks like 28% of GDP today. Next year, Mexico's real exports look like they will be fully 5 times what they were in 1990. Mexico has globalized with a vengeance under NAFTA. But since NAFTA, Mexican real GDP has, as best as we can measure, grown at 3.6 per year. And you might say 3.6% per year is a healthy number, but that's before you've subtracted off Mexican population growth of 2.3% per year, leaving real GDP growth in Mexico to be at 1.3% per year. Slower than the United States, slower than Western Europe. Mexico, in terms of economic prosperity, is further behind the United States now than it was at the start of the 90s, than it was when NAFTA was passed. If you believe that free trade has as its major purpose that of equalizing economies, that of providing the poor with opportunities to successfully emulate the richer, it's not happening. So the hope was that with NAFTA guaranteeing Mexican producers tariff and quota-free access to the U.S. market, the largest consumer market in the world, no matter what else happened in U.S. politics, no matter how protectionist the U.S. became vis-a-vis other producers, and with NAFTA also binding the Mexican government to allow foreign investors to earn healthy rates of return, that this would be a potential division of labor bonanza for Mexico. That increasing trade between the U.S. and Mexico would move both countries toward a greater degree of specialization and a finer division of labor in important industries like autos, where labor-intensive portions were increasingly accomplished in Mexico, textiles, with high-tech spinning and weaving done by machines in the U.S., with lower-tech cutting and sewing done elsewhere, and that such efficiency gains from increasing the extent of the market and promoting the division of labor, well, they should have, by the gospel that we economists have preached for nearly 2.5 centuries now, they should have produced rapid growth in Mexican productivity. Likewise, greater efficiency should have been reinforced by a boom in capital formation, which would have accompanied the guarantee that no future wave of protectionism in the U.S. would shut down factories in Mexico, and that no future wave of populism in Mexico would confiscate foreign-owned factories in Mexico. And the key word here is should. The mean income of Mexico today is barely 15% above that of pre-NAFTA days. And because of rising inequality, the overwhelming majority of Mexicans live no better off than their counterparts did 15 years ago. The only part of Mexican development that you can call a great success has been first the enormous expansion of exports, and those who are doing well off of that expansion of exports, which is overwhelmingly not the workers working in the export industries, and the extraordinary rise in incomes and living standards that comes from greatly increased remittances sent back to Mexico from the United States. And for our economists, this is intellectually a great puzzle. Right? We believe in market forces, we believe in the benefits of trade, specialization of the international division of labor. We think we have seen successful pro-market policies at work in North America and Western Europe over the past 2¼ centuries. We see the enormous increase in Mexican exports to the US over the past decade. We see great strengths in the Mexican economy. A stable macroeconomic environment, fiscal prudence, low inflation, little country risk, a labor force that is increasingly able to move around the country to where the jobs are, a strengthened and solvent banking system, poverty reduction programs that we have at least hope are effective and will be further reformed, high earnings from oil, right, and so forth. Yet what look to us like successful neoliberal policies, right, what looked to me like successful implementation of policies 6 years ago that would be guaranteed to deliver a genuine boom accompanied by rapidly rising real wages in Mexico, they have not delivered the rapid increases in productivity and in working class wages that neoliberals like me, that we would have confidently predicted had we been told back in 1993 that Mexican exports would multiply 5-fold in the next 13 years. But if you told me back in 1993 that NAFTA will pass and Mexican exports will expand 5-fold over the next 13 years, I would have said, well, that's done. It's clearly going to be a wild and extraordinary success. And Mexico is going to be a richer and more developed country significantly come 2006 than it is back in 1992. Now you look at Mexican politics today, and even with the great doubt, to say the least, about what the real outcome of the last presidential election was, there have still been great improvement in political openness and in political competition, right, since the heyday of the PRI's rule back in the 70s and 80s. But how long will this remain stable? A faster growing Mexico seems to be a precondition for long-run stability. So here I sit in 2006, having confidently recommended 13 years ago a program of neoliberal openness and correcting Mexico's economic development. It's scratching my head because the first 2 stages of it seem to have been secured. That is, NAFTA passed, yes. Rapid expansion of the Mexican exports, yes. Political opening, as Mexico's elite seems to want to act more like a North American elite in terms of willingness to accept the rules of the democratic game, yes. But where's the payoff? Where are the benefits to the median Mexican of this shift to neoliberal policies? And why haven't they shown up visibly? And, there are at least 4 potential answers I can give. The first answer, and this I owe to Michael Kremer of Harvard and Brookings, is that those of us who in the early 1990s were talking about the benefits of export-led development and about how more countries should adopt export-led development strategies focused on increasing their openness and integration with the world economy, that we overlooked one thing. Now, admittedly, it's kind of hard to overlook because it has 1.3 billion people and sits there just across the Pacific, and if you go down to the port of Oakland, let alone Long Beach, you can see its economic impact coming in every day in container ships piled 5 high. But the one thing we overlooked was China. that Michael Kremer's argument is that in any generation there is only so much space for export-led development, right? Only so much space on the sofa. And, you know, in the 1970s there can be space for Southern Europe and Japan and the East Asian tigers, and they can all sit comfortably on the sofa, one in each of the 3 seats. But, you know, China takes up 5 seats all by itself. If China is sitting on the export-led development sofa, there's no place for anybody else to do anything other than watch the U.S. price of their goods they make fall and try to figure out how can we reduce what we pay our workers a little more so we can stay competitive with this extraordinary thing going on across the ocean. And that first answer is that, you know, we neoliberals gave Mexico exactly the wrong advice about when to jump onto the export-led development merry-go-round. The second is, you know, demography, the demographic burden of Mexico's rapid population growth. That Mexico has not yet made its way through the demographic transition. And when it is the case that you have to find space for 2.3% more people every year, you know, more houses, more highways, more infrastructure, more education, that simply the burden of sustaining that rate of increase of your capital stock simply to hold yourself constant relative to your rapidly growing population, that makes expecting rapid economic growth unlikely. And the third possibility is, you know, so for that second one, our problem was we overpromised. You know, that is, as indeed people like Rudy Dornbush and Paul Krugman were warning in the early 1990s, that the rhetoric associated with the so-called Washington Consensus, unquote, was greatly overstated, and that policies, while good, would be unlikely to produce anything like the buzz around them. And, you know, Paul Krugman is still around, and I promise to listen to him more carefully in the future, because he was right. Rudy Dornbush, alas, is not still around. But this is yet another way, another sign that I should think in the back of my brain, what would Rudy say? Because he was very wise about this as well. So we have China, we have demography. We have third, that we were simply focusing on the wrong things. Right? That you look at the economic deficiencies that still abound in Mexico, and you see an extraordinarily low average numbers of years of schooling. And more important, with young workers having almost no more formal education than their older counterparts. We see little on-the-job training, in large part because of low schooling. That transplant factories from America are running at Detroit or Cleveland or St. Louis kind of levels of staffing because good workers are still remarkably hard to find. And so the possibilities of having a more employment-intensive manufacturing to boost real wages in Mexico as kind of factories start up there isn't really coming to pass. Heavy bureaucratic burdens on firms, corrupt judges on police, high crime rates, a low productivity informal sector that narrows the tax base, although it contributes to the incomes of local functionaries. But these deficiencies should not have been enough to neutralize Mexico's powerful geographic advantages and the potent benefits of the policies that Adam Smith recommended 230 years ago, should they? Well, they may have been. They may have been enough. We may have been wrong to focus on trade and to have been much better placed to focus on education and corruption. Right, to have told Carlos Salinas de Gortari and company they shouldn't focus on how they can integrate with North America so that all their friends can easily move money from Mexico City to New York and back again. But instead they should have focused on getting teachers who know how to teach and aren't just the feckless cousin of the local party boss who needs a job, right, into the schools. You know, that a much more social democratic, social investment agenda might have served Mexico much, much better. And so that's part three, right? That's simply building up the social and educational capital that maybe that was the key link to Mexican development rather than increasing trade. Certainly there's every reason to think it is the key link now. The fourth possibility is just that we were right after all, that things are just taking longer than we expected. Right? And things are just taking longer than expected because the policies that make Mexico an attractive place to produce for export require a lot of changes that you can't just be produced by waving your hands. That the process of building up infrastructure, building up trade links, building up knowledge links, building up transportation links, that's going to be a long process. And that Mexican exports have quintupled over the past 12 years. It tells us that the process is starting, and we shouldn't be expecting to see that the back of the train has not yet started to move, because the train is very, very long. But we neoliberals can at least be confident that the front is moving, and since we have our faith inherited from Adam Smith, the back of the train is still connected to the front of the train. That if I come back in another 5 or 10 years, I'll be much more optimistic, perhaps as optimistic as I was 6 years ago. That might be true, but it's not. It's an excuse. It's not something I'd bet on. Having witnessed Mexico's slow growth over the past 15 years, I'm shaken. I really don't know what to think. I don't know what the right policy options would have been for the U.S. in 1993 vis-a-vis policies for Mexico. I don't know what the right development strategy for a benevolent Mexican government that wanted to unwind the pre-PRI's domination of Mexican politics and society would have been. In fact, I don't know what the right development policy for a benevolent Mexican government that wants to see Mexico become free, democratic, and prosperous would be today.